The danger is that each one of us is just this like little bubble within which we live in our own world. This is called the philosophical problem of solipsism, and we can't actually break out of it to communicate with each other because there's no bridges among us, because we don't have the same experiences, the absolute same experiences. So we're isolated. And that also means we can't come to agreement on anything, not really. Another very serious problem. Well, if there's one God, then everything is already known in the mind of God, right? God doesn't learn, because learning changes you, and God doesn't change. So everything possible that can be known already pre-exists in the mind of God. What we do is we participate in that knowledge by recognizing. Think of that word, recognize, recognate, know again, to come again to something that we already have at least the capacity to know, and it's written into us, that capacity, that then we can now grab onto it and say, it's there. And we can discover, not create, but discover. And in that interplay between our minds coming into contact with what already is, and the fact that we're made in the image and likeness of God from within the biblical tradition, means that that creates that bridge between a world that's infused with truth and a mind that's capable of recognizing that truth. So in a sense, we do have the capacity to know already. It's built into us what's out there, but then it has to be activated by our active searching and seeking and the act of a will wanting to learn. And there's no contradiction. You could have one moral reality that says, for example, it's morally abhorrent and disgusting and destructive and incomprehensible to kill an unborn child, and another morality that says we should celebrate the death of unborn children because they are a burden on women. You could have these two moralities which are totally opposed to each other, and they could both be equally right and equally wrong at the same time. There'd be no way of adjudicating the debate because there'd be no truth to the matter. And then so who wins when people are engaged in these kinds of debates? They're not really debates. They can't even talk to each other. Who wins is the most powerful. It ultimately doesn't come down to who has the best argument or who's on the side of truth. It comes down to who can force the other to bend to his or her will. That's the cost of saying there's no morality, universal morality. And this sometimes happens in the abortion debate where, someone will say, like, well, it's only because of self-consciousness that a human being is a human being, and we don't believe that, babies, preborn babies are self-conscious, therefore they're not real human beings. And then you can come back and say, well, can you be aborted when you're asleep? Like, is someone justified in killing you as long as your REM level is at a certain level and you're really, really asleep because you don't have self-consciousness? That's the problem of just using specific capacities. The point is if we're going to get real equality, we have to go beyond our bodies, beyond our capacities, beyond what we can do, to something that we are. And something that we are in absolute equality. And in order to get to that, it has to be something immaterial. And the language we typically use for that is a soul. If there's no God, then the universe is defined by materialism and determinism. Now, what materialism just most basically means is that at the heart of everything that exists is ultimately just stuff. And that stuff is not governed with any meaning or purpose. It's just randomly governed by this arbitrary movement of different powers crashing into each other. So you do seek out your own path, but within this landscape, as it were, that creates the boundaries that allow you to seek your own path, because there actually is a truth that you're seeking. And if you need a concrete example of this, think of the diversity of the saints. Think of all the different saints in the church. How different they are from each other. Saint Therese de Lisieux has been recently, it was her feast day not so long ago, right? She lived to the age of 24, and for a good portion of her life was in a Carmelite monastery, nunnery. That's not the right word, that's the old-fashioned word. You know where she was. She lived there, never left the walls, and is now a doctor of the church, right? Because of the experience that she was capable of having and creating and cultivating there. And now we call it what? The little way, right? Where every single act, every single thought, every single gesture, we can choose to infuse it with the love of God. Then think of the great missionary saints. So Saint Teresa of Lisieux she chose to be locked up behind walls. And think of the Jesuits, way back, right? When they would go, they would cross the ocean and risk their lives, and many of them died, right? In these very dangerous adventures to spread the faith. Or St. Thomas Aquinas, that I cite so oftenly. What did he do? He read books most of his life and wrote. Read and wrote, read and wrote, read and wrote. He's a saint too. So you see, we are all called to be saints. All of us are called to be saints. And think of all the different ways that each one of us can become a saint if we're willing to work with God's grace to do it. So not for a moment do we have to believe that we're all sort of marching in one line to the gates of heaven, right? And this really narrow path, and we all have to, don the same uniform and hopefully march right in. No, when the saints go marching in, they're just as diverse as each one of us. And that's because of the framework that this monotheistic God has created for us. So, conclusion. The recognition that there is one God, and therefore one reality and one humanity and one morality and one destination for all of us, it really is one of the greatest and most influential ideas in the history of ideas. If we wanted to push this hard enough, I think I'd say that the whole idea of human rights, the whole idea of equality, the whole idea of dignity, the whole idea of individuality, it wouldn't exist if we didn't have underneath it this conception of the one God. And as we conclude this series of lectures and move to the next, what we're going to see is how this oneness of this sort of abstract God is now going to translate in and through into Christianity, into the form of Jesus Christ, who's going to be the one God made flesh, the universality made particular. And as a biblical passage for us to light the way forward, I quote St. Paul writing to the Ephesians, "There's one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to the one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above in all, through all, and in all." Amen.
Who was the person who recognized this in the beginning?
I think it's fair to say, now again, this is an area of enormous academic inquiry and spiritual inquiry, but I think it's fair to say it's the revelation of the Hebrew people.
So no one person there, philosopher, recognized that and started that.
I think it was communal, and even within the Old Testament itself, you see monotheism growing over time to where it becomes very, very clear, especially by Deuteronomy, that when they're talking about Yahweh, they're not talking about the most powerful God of all the other gods, but rather that Yahweh is God, and the other gods they're idols. They're not real gods; they're idols. So I think it gets traced. Look at this little tribe, right? Yeah. This little tribe who, for a long time, historically was a group of slaves. And they are in some cases, like the worst example of humanity over and over and over again. The Old Testament's very clear on that. They're constantly not only just making mistakes, but totally violating God's covenant. And yet this is where revelation, the idea is born and given to the world.
Intrinsic evil through our politicians. Should that be discussed and preached in our churches?
Yes.
And those people identified?
Yes, and not but. There has to be great care. Now, are there some people who you can specifically identify as engaged in intrinsic evil? Absolutely. But the problem is, I won't say the problem, the danger is that if you do that wrongly, then you put your own soul in danger as well. Meaning that if I identify someone as engaged in an intrinsic evil, and it's not actually an intrinsic evil, it's maybe a bad judgment, or it may be, it may result in circumstances that are out of that person's control, and I publicly denounce them, then I've brought judgment upon myself. So I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying it's something that's very, it has to be done with great care. Also, just to use a political example, so we can say abortion is an intrinsic evil.
Right.
Is a minimum wage under $15 an intrinsic evil? It might be bad, but is it evil, right? So that's what we call a prudential question. It depends upon judgment, and it's something that we have to work out in the community. So if I were to go out and I were to say this politician and this person are exploiting their workers and they're intrinsically evil because they refuse to give a $15 an hour wage, and the reason they're doing it is because they would have to close down their restaurant if in fact they paid that level to all their employees. And you see what I've done now is I've poisoned the whole debate. I've lit fire to it, and there's no going back. So it's a bomb, and it can be used, and I think it's not being used. I agree that it's not being used where it should be used, but it has to be used with the greatest of care.
What is the church's position on AI, artificial intelligence, that is becoming to a great fruition here shortly? And some claim it will recognize itself as being a being.
Yeah.
Does the church have any position on that?
There's it doesn't have a position, as far as I know. It hasn't developed a sort of doctrinal or magisterial position, but there's certainly an active area of conversation within the circles of moral theologians, for example. And I think it basically comes down to this: artificial intelligence, properly understood, is morally neutral, meaning that it can be used for either good or for evil. And that's the case with all technology. Actually, technology literally means the study of techne, which in Greek, techne is a form of knowledge that it's just sort of, you do it because you can. It's knowledge for the sake of knowledge. You don't really tie it to any conception of the good. So technology is only good insofar as you locate it within a framework of morality. It's not moral in of itself. So think of how AI could help in many circumstances. Think of medical circumstances. I mean, if it's the case that robot doctors are going to be able to perform surgeries in ways that human hands just can't possibly do, then the church would have every reason to say there's nothing wrong with that. On the other hand, if you start having AI impinge upon human freedom and start taking over large swaths of our lives, and this could potentially even include causing lots of people to be laid off and not providing the structure to move them into other forms of employment, then it would be bad. So here we can say that not all evils are intrinsically evil. AI is not intrinsically evil, it's potentially evil and dangerous too. Now, to use a different example of what the church has said is intrinsically evil is the nuclear bomb. Why? Because there's no use, while there are some uses of artificial intelligence that could potentially be good, there's no potentially good use of, this is the church's teaching, and I know it's very contested in terms of the actual end of World War II and how it was deployed. But the actual sort of the structure of the argument itself is that there's never a good reason to kill massive amounts of people. And so for that reason, nuclear technology understood as a weapon is intrinsically evil.
I was thinking of the term human equality. I'm thinking of when you talked about the groups and populations being all uniform, for instance, like totalitarianism. I'm thinking of the group that is now called Pride, and the gay community, I think there's those LGBTQ and XYZ, all of that. It's a group that really wants to bring to the little children, starting with 1 hour storytelling in the libraries and in the schools, and they want to eliminate, just do away with that there is a he and a she from the day they're born, and then it's final, and that there's no change. There's no room for them as they grow up to be a she rather than a him if he was born a male. And they're serious about it. And I've heard them so much in the political arena, and because of that feather on the politician, they just seem to bend over backwards for them to get the vote, because it's a huge population that thinks that way. So I'm kind of don't have any kids, but I mean, my neighbors have them. My community has kids in there. You never really leave education, because this is what it's all about. We're being educated. Look at us here. We're learning, but we still have to live that everyday life. And human life is one thing, like abortion, but then also the lives that are okay, but they want to make them change their mind to think of themselves as a he, not a she.
Yeah. Well, this lecture on monotheism actually can speak directly to that question as well. Why? What I've been trying to lay out, and again, I'm just to the best of my capacity, I'm just trying to explain what the Catholic understanding of it is to the best of my ability. So, I'm not trying to give you my arguments, but rather what could be identified as the Church's arguments. I've been laying out sort of two poles here. So on the one hand, we have true diversity and individuality, but that individuality and diversity is governed by a uniformity. It's governed by a truth. So the question therefore becomes, well, how do we then make differentiations or distinctions between forms of diversity that are licit, that are allowed, that are good, and forms of diversity that are not licit, not allowed, and not good? Because diversity in and of itself just means difference. So difference without some framework of unity is just sheer individuality, and then there's nothing that binds anybody together whatsoever. So you don't really have community. So diversity, and I know we hear it a lot, like diversity, and we're all supposed to understand that in a particular kind of way, but the truth is diversity by itself is literally meaningless. Okay, so what kinds of diversity? Well, from a monotheistic tradition, and then specifically into the biblical tradition, into the Catholic Christian tradition, what limits diversity is the structure of reality. The structure of reality. So I can be a different kind of human in the sense that I could, I chose to become a professor, but perhaps I could have chose to become a lawyer. Perhaps I could have chose to do some other kind of profession. Certainly nothing with my hands, but I had some options available to me. And those are genuine forms of diversity. But can I choose to become an animal? I mean, can I choose to become a bear? Can I choose to become a cat? No, I can't. Why? Because I'm limited by the very structure of reality. The issue is, and the problem is that there's a form of morality now that has become dominant that has totally severed itself from nature. Part of the reason where we sever morality from God is then we also sever morality from that which God creates. And so nature no longer has any kind of boundaries that it can offer to the exercise of the free human will. So what are you left with? You're just left with people's experiences and their desires and their own wills. Out of this is born these movements where people say, this is how I experience myself, and given that I am free to do whatever I want to do because there's no other restrictions, so long as I have what? Consent. That becomes the only boundary to any kind of action among other people. Then I can do whatever I do. Now that started off with having sexual relations among people of the same sex. because the argument was, well, it's consensual, it's between adults. But you see, at the heart of it, it wasn't just this issue of consent, it was this issue of there's no nature. So now you've seen how that one argument can now be replicated across different forms of understanding what it means to be human. So now it's, well, I not only experience myself as attracted to other people of the same sex, I experience myself, well, as a different sex. Now, in and of itself, that's problematic, right? Because we can say, how do you know what it's like to be that which you are not if you're not already that? You get into kind of the Meno problem. Like, how do I know what it's like to be a woman if I've never actually been a woman, unless I say that I am a woman, in case, why do I need to change into a woman to be a woman if I'm already a woman? I know that sounds kind of silly, but that's like, it doesn't quite make sense just on the sort of the philosophical grounds. But it's based on this premise that I choose who I want to be. Then the question is what's the limiting principle? And the reality is there's no limiting principle. So one example that I frequently point to is that there are some people who sincerely believe, by their own accounts, right, how can we actually get inside what it's like to be them, that they are a disabled person in an abled person's body. They're in an able person's body, but they know that their true identity is somebody who's disabled. And so they want the right to be able to have surgical procedures that sever their spinal cord so that they can actually finally be in the body that they know that they belong in. There's also people who are sincerely convinced that they are babies, and that they may manifest as an adult, but they actually still are babies. And so they live out these fantasies, including sleeping in cribs and drinking from bottles and wearing diapers, that they're in babies. And we could say, well, that's different. No, it's not. It's seriously not different. Because you're saying the principle of how I define what is good is what I experience. And so long as my experience and my acting on that experience has the consent of myself and apparently the doctor who's going to perform this, there's nothing wrong with it. But what you see that lets in is that any experience of yourself, this is now going to include potentially, and I know this is, you get a lot of heat for saying this, but pedophilia, for those people who experience themselves as attracted to children. And then you can start having a debate, well, what children is kind of culturally defined, right? Like children back in the Renaissance, you were a child until you were about 10, but then you started thinking if you were, we'd still say girl, but they'd say if you're a young woman, but started getting married by the age 12, 13. So now you can start erasing those distinctions as well, and you're left saying that any attempt to try and prevent somebody from doing that by saying, no, that's wrong, is anti-inclusive, anti-diversity, and some form of oppression. But that's only because we've adopted this view that morality is only based in the human will itself and consent. What monotheism comes along and responds to that is that that's a false understanding of reality. It's literally delusional. Not only delusional, it's not only can lead to bad consequences, of course it can, but there is a nature. There is a reality. There is a fixed structure that governs. And we are free to pretend there isn't. I'm free, as some people have done, to mutilate my body so that I look like a cat and eat my food off the floor. I'm free to do that, but that doesn't make me a cat. I haven't become a cat, you see. So this is the time where, again, these abstract questions now have to be re-enter into common dialogue and common parlance in order to reestablish some grounds for common debate and common morality. Because if we continue down this path of the will being sovereign, it will end up, I kid you not, in bestiality, in incest, and in a movement called transhumanism, where human beings believe that they're actually properly better understood as robots and want to have entire parts of their brain removed and replaced with circuitry, and it should be their right. I know that sounds sensationalistic, and that I'm like a scare tactic, because I can hear all these voices in my head of all these people who are already attacking me. But it's just the case conceptually. It's just the case. Yeah. What you make permissible will be done. I guarantee it.
So a question that developed on this side of the room was in the context of a monotheism, and it sounds like we might tap into it in the second series. But would you explain if there's one God, the three divine persons, Father, Son,
The
Holy
Trinity.
Spirit?
That's good. That's good. So that's always been one of the, for example, in Islam, one of the greatest problems that faithful Muslims find with Christianity is they say, you're worshiping three gods and it's Allah, right? God is one. And in fact, this has long been a critique of Christianity, is that Christianity is sort of cheating by saying that it is a monotheistic religion, but it's, it recognizes God in the Trinity. Trinitarian theology is immensely complex, but I think St. Augustine has a good basic way for us to think about it. And I think I've addressed this before in some ways in previous lectures, but it's certainly pertinent now again. So I am an I, but I am also a me, right? Because I know that I exist. In fact, I don't not only know that I exist, I also have a kind of, I can see myself, and I can even make judgments about myself. And so I exist as an I and a me. Does that make me two people? I haven't all of a sudden split ontologically into two people where I and a me are separate. And the I becomes the me and the me becomes the I. I'm still the same person, I just recognize that there's the two of us. Well, not only is there the two of us, there's actually the bridge between the two of us, right? It's not that I'm I and then me looking at the I and then I looking at the me. It's a sort of an ontological connection that you can sort of slide up and down, but is always there. Well, interpreted through the Trinitarian scheme, the I and the me becomes the we. It's the relationship between the I and the me. And I'm using the analogical example of a human being, but if we think of God in those terms, then what we say is that the relationship between the I and the me is one of perfect relationship. It's one of perfect love. And so the I and the me and the we all form an internal sort of dynamic relationship in the sense that there's life. There's life among the three persons of the Trinity, but it's one God, just as I'm one person. In fact, I understand myself as one person in light of the existence of the Trinity. I can use the Trinity to help me understand who I am as a unified one human being who is in relationship with himself. So being in a relationship doesn't ontologically imply that there's three different beings, but rather one being that knows it is God, God knows he's God, and God is in relationship with himself. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And then that gets mapped onto salvation history through Christ in time and space.